We're delighted to be joined by Professor Marion Turner here at the festival this year, and we're going to be talking about her most recent book, The Wife of Bath, a Biography. Professor, would you mind talking about why you were attracted by The Wife's Tale?
Well, The Wife of Bath is what I say the first ordinary woman in English literature. So she's a really extraordinary figure because, of course, there have always been women in English literature, but the Wife of Bath, who's created by Chaucer in the 14th century, she's the first character who's what we might think of as ordinary. She's middle-aged, she's middle class, she makes lots of mistakes, she has a job, she talks about her sexual desires and sexual experiences, she goes out with her friends, she goes on holiday. So she's really different from the queens or princesses or prostitutes or witches that had populated English literature before her. So I think that to tell her story is to tell the story of a really changing time for women in English history, the 14th century, and then to look at kind of what's happened to her across time. There's just so many interesting stories to tell there.
And of course, in your book, you mentioned there was a golden age for golden age for women in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Yeah, so people are often really surprised by this because a lot of people assume that medieval women led very, very limited domestic existences. And I think it's really important not to try to idealise the experience of medieval women. I mean, of course, I certainly wouldn't want to have been a woman at a time when, you couldn't vote and there's not very good contraception or medical care and so on. But nonetheless, women did have a lot more opportunities than people often think, and particularly in England and other parts of Northwest Europe compared with other parts of the world and indeed other parts of Europe. So at that time we do find that lots and lots of women had jobs, for example, and had a range of jobs. So mainly we find them working in things like the cloth trade or victualling, so brewing, serving food and drink, domestic service and so on. But you also sometimes come across women who did things like being blacksmiths or scribes or parchment makers. But what was really key in terms of this golden age was that women's legal and inheritance rights were actually quite decent in the later Middle Ages. So that in the 14th and 15th centuries, women had the right to keep a big chunk of wealth if they were widowed in particular. So in other parts of Europe, they might only get their dowry back, and they might only get that back if they stayed with their husband's family, for example. In England, women would get, to keep a third of their husband's property automatically, a half if there were no children. They had better rights in cities such as London than in other places. So women had quite a lot of power because they had economic power. They weren't expected to remain dependent on men if they were widowed in particular. So widows had a particular kind of power. So I think that what we can see this partly in the context of kind of long-term trends in English history and law, but also particularly in the context of the plague. Okay. That after the Black Death, which of course hit in the middle of the 14th century and was a pandemic on a scale that really we can't imagine, an appalling catastrophe. But for the people who survived, things actually got better because we've got the same amount of land to farm and half the people to do it. So for the poor, wages went up, opportunities expanded, people could move around more, people could do different kinds of jobs. And that actually applied to women as well as men. We see more women moving to cities, more women entering the workforce and earning more money. As I say, this was already happening. It's not a completely new thing, but the plague did help women in that way. And hundreds of years later, when things changed economically and there was a big demographic boom, things got worse for women. So I think you can compare the effect of the plague a bit to something like the effect of the First World War, demographic disaster. But actually there was some improvements for women that came out of that.
Interesting. And then, of course, how many women actually read Chaucer at the time? Was it very much just a very few women kind of in the court, the aristocracy, the gentry, or was it actually any other women managed to?
I mean, that's a really good question. And of course, in Chaucer's own lifetime, because he's writing at a time before print, so overall, we've got relatively small numbers of people of either sex reading his work. At the same time, literacy was much higher than people often assume. Again, in London, we've got something like 50% of people are literate. And although women would be much less likely to be able to read Latin, they were more likely to be able to read, English and French. So educated men would be trilingual in English, French and Latin. Educated women would probably not have Latin, but they would have English and French. So because Chaucer's writing in English, that makes it more accessible to women than his text would have been had he written in Latin. We are still talking about limited numbers. Your average, peasants, either men or women, are not reading literary texts being produced at that time. But Chaucer, in his texts, he sometimes addresses them to mixed audiences. So he sometimes addresses women as well as men in his texts. And his poetry is partly being read in courtly environments, as you mentioned, and he even addresses one of his poems to the Queen. And his very first extant poem was written about the death of a woman. They were also being read in inns, in pubs, in maybe the actual Tabard Inn, which was a real place, as well as being fictionalised at the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. So, and there would have been mixed audiences in those inns, in households. And what's also important to remember is that reading was such a different thing in the 14th century, because this isn't about getting your own copy of the book and going and reading on your own. Someone would be reading out loud, often in either a court or in a domestic environment or in a pub or tavern, to a large group of people who would be listening and then talking, discussing, kind of interacting with the text. So yeah, the numbers are certainly limited, but it's not the case that he was writing for a male audience.
Okay. I was going to say, you published a number of books. What are you going to focus on next?
Well, I've got a number of projects on the go. I guess one thing that particularly people watching here might be interested in is I'm curating a big exhibition about Chaucer in the Bodleian in Oxford, which is going to open in December this year, December 2023, and run for 4 months. And that's called Chaucer Here and Now, and it's about Chaucer right across time. So, and there's going to be an accompanying book with that as well. And we're going to look at how readers across time have interacted with Chaucer, created their own Chaucers. So from the earliest scribes, through Victorian Chaucer, Imperial Chaucer, right up to modern translations of Chaucer. I've just managed to acquire a Ukrainian translation to go into this exhibition, for example. So that's one new project that's coming up.
Excellent. We're looking out for that one. A final question. You've only just arrived at the festival. What are you looking forward to seeing for the rest of the week?
Well, I have literally just arrived, as you say, so I want to go and explore, and I'm particularly interested to see on the map that there's like a medieval area, and so of course I'm drawn to that and going to see exactly what you've got there.
That's excellent. Professor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.